So it says that we are going live. I'll just check and we then start. Yes, we are live. Hello everyone, good afternoon. This is Ishan Sharma and you are watching Caravan. With me on the screen, I have Professor Charu Gupta joining us to deliver today's Caravan special lecture. Professor Charu Gupta is currently serving as the Professor of Modern India in the Department of History at University of Delhi. Her work focuses on gender, sexuality, masculinity, caste, religious identities, and vernacular literature in early 20th century North India. And her first book, Sexuality, Obscenity, Community, Women, Muslims, and the Hindu public in colonial India address print and popular culture as a significant, if ambivalent, site for the reproduction of patriarchy in late colonial North India. And in her latest monograph, The Gender of Caste, representing Dalits in print, published by Permanent Black and University of Washington Press in 2016, she focused on practices of distinction and hierarchy within the Hindu community through the regulation of caste and specifically through the impact of caste ideology on women in the interwar period. And another co-authored book of Professor Gupta was Contested Coastlines, Fisherfolk's Nations and Borders in South Asia, published by Routledge, that probed the troubled journey of coastal fisherfolk arrested and jailed by India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh for having entered each other's territorial waters. She has been the guest co-editor of special issues of journals such as South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies, Biography and Interdisciplinary Quarterly, and Cultural Dynamics. And she has published more than 40 peer-reviewed papers in leading journals, including in journals of Asian Studies, Modern Asian Studies, South Asia Journal of Women's History, Economic and Political Weekly, and Indian Economic and Social History Review. Today, Professor Gupta is going to deliver the lecture titled Forbidden Vernacular Histories of Love, Sex, and Pleasure in Modern India. And without further ado, I formally invite Professor Gupta to deliver the lecture. And those who are watching us, they can leave their comments and questions in the live chat. We will be taking the questions towards the end of the lecture. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining us.
A very warm thanks, Ishan and Karwa, for inviting me to be a part of your journey. You've been doing an amazing job, and I've been following you, and you're making history so popular to a larger audience, and you really need to be congratulated for what you have been doing. So, and also thank you for that long introduction. I'm a historian of modern India. And so in today's talk, basically, I'm going to reflect on whether historically, India has usually feared love and pleasure. Is it because of colonialism and modernity that certain kinds of love, sexualities, and pleasures came to be forbidden? So, and I largely work, with Hindi materials and popular Hindi materials. So, I'm going to draw from a range of archival sources, but particularly Hindi popular literature from early 20th century. And through that, I will focus on forbidden histories of love, sex, and pleasure in modern India. And I'm going to do that through five very brief snapshots. And if someone wants to pose any comment or questions after the talk, I'm open to that. So first, I will discuss some of the anxieties in canonized Hindi literature versus the pleasures of popular, so-called dirty, vernacular pulp. Second, I will look at, the kind of taboos against homosexuality that became much more institutionalized in the colonial period. And amidst that, how certain kinds of male bondings emerged, and we do have some kind of archival sources for that. Third, I will look at kind of clandestine pleasures in the domestic sphere, particularly by looking at this relationship between the younger brother-in-law and the elder sister-in-law, the Devar and Bhabi relationship. And in the colonial period, the kind of changes, that you can see there. Fourth, I will talk of intercaste and interreligious intimacies, and I'm going to talk all of them very briefly. And finally, the pleasures of vernacular sexology, which sees an efflorescence, particularly, in the period between the two world wars. There was a huge flourishing of, materials. And I have seen Hindi, but I know that in even other regional languages, there was a lot of material around sexology that came to be published at this time. So, when we talk of love, sex, and pleasure, we should note that they are not just practices. They are constituted in various historical periods, in different geographical sites, in print and visual cultures, and they encompass elite and popular, women and men, literature and poetry, erotic art and architecture, food and fantasy, caste and class. Histories of love, sex, and pleasure are also, histories of accepted norms and their transgressions, because they play with regulatory discourses of religion on the one hand and science on the other. Love and pleasure actually spreads out widely and unevenly, and it often escapes any kind of systematization. So, an Indian history of love, sex, and pleasure also interestingly makes us reflect on the anecdotal, the mundane, and the everyday. I mean, if you go to the official archive and try to look for a history of love and pleasure, perhaps you will not get it, because the official archives often record the painful, the tragic, or the cataclysmic, the larger than life events. So when we talk of histories of love, sex, and pleasure, we are actually really expanding our archival arenas. And histories of, whether it is Dalits, whether it is questions of gender and sexuality, they have taught us, how we need to be innovative with our sources. For narratives of love and pleasure, particularly, I think the everyday is ubiquitous, because it is much more centrally located there. Women are much more visible there. So I think the everyday sphere is very important when you talk of histories of love, sex, or pleasure. So because the traces of love and pleasure come from different places, they come from different sources. Now I am using popular Hindi material, or kind of Hindi print culture that was emerging, but you can use the oral narratives, the personal diaries, autobiographies. Those are the sources from where you get these kinds of history, and they really tell us a tale of hidden treasures of research. So in my work, spread over 30 years, in which I have done some work at least on histories of love, the vernacular really has been my constitutive rather than supplementary archive. And I think in terms of its historical and literary politics, also, it is important to recognize that the vernacular itself, is a malleable concept. and its meanings are shifting and they are contingent on different contexts. So, a vernacular signifying practice sometimes has problems because it can offer us, elements that affirm everyday power relations. It can uphold dominant values. But at other moments, it can be counter hegemonic, it can be liberatory, and it can act as a vehicle of dissent. So the context, is very important in this case. So the vernacular has no, particular notion, that one can claim authority over or appropriate, because there are multiplicities residing in a seemingly unitary vernacular. So it is it is an expansive form which encompasses not only bhasha sahitya or regional literature, but it is also a synonym for one's matri bhasha or mother tongue, which questions language hegemony of any kind. And these vernacular landscapes actually became the trouble sites, where divergent representations uh, and contestations around pleasure, sex, and love came to be staged in late colonial North India. Now, if we look at some of our ancient Hindu or even medieval Islamic texts, then they reveal rich histories of love and pleasure, from Kama Sutra and Kumar Sambhav to the enchanting world of Urdu poetry, from sculptures of anal sex to threesomes and orgies on the wall of temples, and also importantly extolling of pleasures of non-reproductive sex. So in our histories and experiences of love and pleasure, what I'm interested in exploring is the shifts and displacements and kind of new emergences that occurred with the coming of colonialism and modernity. Why were there so many increasing moral panics and censorships, much more, with the coming of colonialism? So we know, of course, that, kind of taboos on love and pleasure are carried, of course, foremost by the state. And the kind of laws that are enacted and the kind of institutions, that come up, etc. But there are also kind of explicit and implicit censorships, by a kind of moralist brigade, which may constitute the dominant castes or majority religious communities or patriarchal structures. So, and of course, when we are talking of histories of sexuality, then of course Foucault's work is important because Foucauldian framework, underlines how there was this with the coming of modernity, there was this propagation of disciplinary regimes, and also the rise of literacy, the spread of print. All this led to an intensification in the management and policing of sexuality, love, and pleasure in the modern period. And riding on this kind of a wave of an overwhelming ideal of puritanical Victorian morality and chastity, the everyday pleasures and enjoyments of the colonized, whether it is like festival of Holi, singing of marriage songs, uh, courtesans or fairs or watching Nautanki, or the poetic descriptions of the female body, erotic representations of non-normative sexualities. All this came to be increasingly depicted, by the Britishers. and also a section of Indian elites and aspiring Hindu middle classes as, breeding ground, for a spectrum of imagined vices, as, a loci of decadence, uh, which were used in the rhetoric, of an evangelical civilizing mission on the one hand, and the serious business of nationalism on the other. So in many ways, with modernity and colonialism, the disciplining of pleasure got much more institutionalized. So now I'm going to share with you a slide kind of presentation where I will begin with my first snapshot. So just bear with me for a minute. um, Okay. So what we see is, I'm going to take examples from canonized Hindi literature. And this was a period, when efforts were being made at, linguistic standardization of Hindi. And this was combined with, attacks on any hints of eroticism and obscenity in Hindi literature, because this was seen as a hallmark of a decadent, feminine, and uncivilized culture. So there is a fear of, growing fear of romance, of sexual and bodily pleasures, which are seen as somehow, transgressing the ideals of the nation. And sex came to be linked much more with procreation and not pleasure. And aesthetics became an exercise in ethics. So there was a whole kind of discourse on brahmacharya, for example, in this period, that we need to preserve our semen for the energy, the energy of the semen to serve the nation, that kind of discourse. So brahmacharya was also given new meanings, at this time. And at this time, there was this influential section of Hindi writers which really attacked the sensual Shringar Ras and Riti Kal poetry, which the period of which was around 16th to 18th centuries, a little earlier as well, some of them. So where, which was filled with erotic descriptions of women. And of course, that this poetry is problematic in its own ways. It was largely meant as court poetry. But, there is increasing attack on this kind of erotic descriptions of women, and also on descriptions of the parakya, the other woman, or lover, the so-called, so what we see is, Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi, for example, who was one of the most influential Hindi ideologues, who established Khari Boli as, as the form for writing prose in, from early 20th century, and who was also the editor of this leading Hindi magazine, Saraswati. He critiqued this Riti Kal poetry for its supposed, dirty and sinful portrayal of women lovers. Or, Sumitra Nandan Pant, who was one of the most prominent Chayavadi poet, and he's really known for his descriptions of nature and Prakriti. Even he, attacked this kind of sensual and allegedly gaudy descriptions of women. And interestingly, he juxtaposed it to this devoted and chaste, Hindu wife. So in many ways, this kind of critiques, led to, in many ways, disappearance of this kind of joyous figure of Radha. And Radha is interesting because she's not a mother, she's not a wife, she is the parakya, she's the lover. And we see how the figure of Radha almost completely disappears, from canons of Hindi literature, from the syllabus from normative poetry. And in some ways, the image of the woman became quite moral. And it was also seen that, this is a positive thing. It is good for the woman herself because, she can now devote her time, to the service of domesticity or to the service of the nation. At the same time, I think modernity, brought its own material sexual pleasures, and it also brought popular mass entertainment. So the intersections between everyday life, sex, sociality, and colonial power, that they show that while control over eroticism and pleasure, was brought under increasing prominence at this time, there were also a rich variety of, experiences that reveal to us complexities of, literal, visual, and cultural imaginations. And they were also, I think, placing limits upon this kind of proscriptions of forbidden love and all kinds of love, actually. So in many ways, what I argue is that while this kind of attack is very prominent, but still there is no single code of, middle class morality. There is no final triumph of a sexual conservatisms. So I think the disciplinary power of whether it is colonialism or, normative kind of regulations was at times diluted, because this is also a period, when caste hierarchies and Hindu patriarchies are being qualified, being challenged to a limited extent. Uh, Reforms, national movement, education, first time women are getting formal education, women's presence in the public arena, they all signaled, some opportunities for women and also for men, however limited they prove to be. So I think sexuality and pleasure came to be expressed in a number of ways. So print in many ways also facilitated, this widespread production and distribution of uh, cheaply priced, so-called these dirty books and ashleel books, and advertisements of, aphrodisiacs, that was so visible in the various newspapers of that time. And in some ways, I think erotic consumerism became a part of this kind of publishing boom, providing a new mass entertainment, and also at times, of course, strengthening the normative dominant paradigms, but at times I think also puncturing them to some extent, and in some ways, this is a very rich archive, so I think this theater of the local and the vernacular, it became really central to texts of sex, love, fun, and pleasure. Of course, social reformers treated romantic love as an irrelevant joke. But we see that, depictions of romantic love, premarital and post-marriage, in many ways in the modern print public culture, we see, of course, it is very much within heteronormative paradigms, but it is altering intimate concerns, and it is bringing a new intensity in conjugal relationships. Um, for example, sex manuals in Hindi really flourished at this time, or pamphlets and songs of Braj, around Holi. They actually sometimes outnumbered so-called reformist, didactic, educational and nationalist kind of literature that was being produced. So for example, if you look at, there were these books which combined erotica, classics, and science. So many books were published in Hindi, in early 20th century, which had words like Kam Shastra, Kok Shastra, Riti Shastra, Rati Kriya. And, and of course, most of these are against masturbation. They are against multiple sex partners. Uh, they are making sex knowable, to a Hindi reading public at a relatively cheaper price. And weaving together sexual ethics, knowledge, and politics, they are embracing a range of standpoints that at times can collude, as I said, with normative and dominant paradigms, but at times they can defy this imperium of, normative pleasures. So the vernacular opens up a plural and heterogeneous world of epistemic possibilities of pleasure, at times incorporating Sanskrit and Persian, but often going beyond them. So of course, there is wavering patronage and there is censorship. Actually, such publications found a way and they thrived in this period, and they were sustained by market forces, by the demands of the time. So the print and the visual created spatial, intimate spaces that opened ancillary textures, which precluded the crafting of, any master narrative in some ways. And it was of course embarrassing for the prudish and conservative elites, but they offer, in some ways, they offer a dissent against the flawed normativities of the time. So the vernacular in some ways led to a democratization of pleasure at this time. So this kind of an overwhelming argument that, we tend to make about the triumph of sexual conservatism and a grim morality in modern India needs to be qualified to some extent. So let me move to my, second snapshot. Now, of course, dominant narratives of love, uphold heterosexual, same community and caste relationships. And these got strengthened in diverse ways in colonial India, because there were these new kinds of ideals of monogamous and companionate marriages. So in this climate, any talk of same-sex attractions, represented a dangerous breach to nationalist ideals, to, community assertions. They also challenged this kind of idea of masculinity, which was being presented by British, where they were saying that, they were juxtaposing the masculinizing European identity with this kind of feminizing, native identity, or and in challenging this kind of British notions of masculinity, the nationalists and reformers were constructing their own notions of masculinity, whether it is the image of the warrior Krishna, or again the discourses of brahmacharya. So from Vivekananda to Gandhi, from Sanatan Dharmis to Arya Samajis, they all are working out this kind of different images of masculinity. But whether it is British or whether it is Indians, they all are working within a heterosexual kind of paradigm of male strength, So in this context, came this publication, and I've written about it. And of course, Ruth Vanita has, translated this book. It was called Chocolate in Hindi, and it was published by this very colorful and interesting figure called, oh, I'm so sorry, by this very colorful and interesting figure called Pandey, Bechen Sharma Ugra. So what we see is that This book was published in 1927, and it dealt with, sodomy, sexual acts between adult males and adolescent boys, and questions of homosexuality. Now, Chocolate was this collection of, eight short stories, very interesting titles like Hey Sukumar, Vyabhichari Pyar, Jail Me, or Hum Fidaye Lucknow, Kamariya Nagin Si Bal Khai. And these stories, they were written in a titillating fashion. And they were supposedly against homosexuality. But in the process, they also acknowledged the wide prevalence of, these practices. And, Chocolate was, and of course, Ugra writes in this kind of titillating, interesting style, because he's hinting at these homosexual tendencies between Krishna and Arjun, between even Ram and Tulsidas. So of course, but more than that, what these stories are doing is they are showing that these kind of modern sites, with its gardens, jails, colleges, libraries, these are sites of, homosexual pleasures, which are absorbing elements of public parade and private desire, uh, hurried encounter and lengthy leisure. And Chocolate was a commercial sensation, and within 6 weeks, two editions of it were sold out. But interestingly, it was banned, and there was this huge campaign against it, known as Ghasleti Andolan, which was sustained for 12 years. It was backed by this new Hindi loci of authority, university departments, literary associations, important journals. Chocolate invoked a hysterical reaction. And I think it was both a paternalistic and a moralist kind of stance, because Ugru was writing on a taboo subject. He was speaking the unspeakable, and he's also putting into doubt, the kind of ideals of heterosexual regime. I think this presents an interesting case, of how we need to go to other kinds of sources, when we try to look at same-sex desires in relationships, in the colonial period. Let me move to my third snapshot very briefly, which is, the kind of clandestine intimacies in the domestic sphere. Now, of course, there's a lot written on this kind of Devar Bhabi relationship, the younger brother-in-law and the sister-in-law. And, the Bhabi, or the elder sister-in-law, is idealized as a maternal figure, but she's also been this kind of an object and subject of erotic desire and pleasure, even modern India, the Savita Bhabi kind of comic strips, and we have had, literature, films, folk songs, they're replete with these kind of references to the desired and desiring sister-in-law, and this kind of illicit liaisons between Devar and Bhabi. Now, I think in the colonial period, what happened was, whether it is because of urbanization, growing or increasing migration, or growing loneliness, or because spread of education, what we see is that perhaps a section of women were seeking in such kind of relationships, a degree of solace and escape from everyday drudgery. Now, such and these undercurrents, led to these kind of exaggerated fears, among a section of reformers in colonial India, who insisted on their prohibition. And the anxiety is reflected in the series of cartoons that were, published in the most celebrated magazine of the time, Chand. And what these cartoons did was that they depicted on the one side, the kind of ideal relationship between Lakshman and Sita, pointing that how Lakshman, when Sita is abducted, he's not even able to recognize her earrings because he's never looked at her in eyes, he's always looking at her feet. And now look at this current modern Kali Yuga times, where the younger brother-in-law is showing kissing pictures to the Bhabi, or, So in some ways they are combing their hair and romancing them. So again, there is this kind of juxtaposition. If you see, on the one hand is Lakshman and Sita, this kind of idealized relationship between Devar and Bhabi, and on the other hand, the husband turns his back and romance in the household starts. So again, these are exaggerated depictions, but they also reveal certain kinds of anxiety, and this is a kind of a moral crusade against supposed misdeeds of Devar and Bhabi. And so, you have, so what these show is uh, that perhaps, such relationships maybe not becoming common, but women were, perhaps seeking in this a degree of fun, pleasure, however may you look at it. And these are creating these kind of anxieties about any kind of forbidden expressions of love. Now we also know that love and pleasure are not neutral categories. They have caste, class, and religion. So let me move to my next snapshot,
Well,
where
we
yeah.
can't see the slides, I think.
You cannot see the slides? Oh,
No,
really? Okay, just hold on. Let me see. So none of the slides have been visible till now.
no, no, ma'am.
Really? Why didn't you tell this to me before? Are you being
No.
able to see now?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, so let me just go back to series of. So do you want me to just quickly run through all the slides that I showed earlier?
Yes, yes, you can. Otherwise, you explained really well.
Okay, okay. So, I mean, I'll just quickly, if oh, my apologies. I really, I wish you had stopped me earlier because you missed out on these. So these were the quotes from Mahavir Prasad and Sumitra Nandan Pant that I was talking about, which attacked the Naika and the Parakya. And then I was talking about these ads of aphrodisiacs that flourished in the market, juxtaposing those. And then I moved to kind of romantic kind of literature that was being published at this time. And then I was describing chocolate, the chocolate which has been translated into English now by Ruth Vinita. So you can buy chocolate, the English translation of it. And then I was looking at these kind of relationships between Devar and Bhabi. So there you see this kind of juxtaposition, where you see, uh, uh, they was showing these kind of dirty pictures, to the Bhabi. So, so now I was moving to my next snapshot about, how love and pleasure also have a caste, class, and religion. So basically, in late colonial India, various kinds of Brahmanical patriarchies and Hindu identities, they sought to censure, any hint of intimacy, romance, and illicit pleasures, particularly of upper caste Hindu women. And I'm saying this because I've looked particularly at Hindi literature, and particularly vis-a-vis any kind of perceived other, be it the Muslim male, the Dalit woman. So this quote relates to the Dalit woman, where there is this anxiety about mixing, between upper caste women and Dalit women, and there is this kind of instructions being given to women to, to not get too close to these kind of women who come in the house, so Dalit, to do various kinds of work. Or there are instructions to women to keep away from servants, from Muslim men, etc. Also, we see, of course, that roti beti ties, what we, the ties between food and marriage taboos, they have been very central to uh, the maintenance of endogamy, because that's the cornerstone of caste, and to spatial and bodily exclusions, because, it is through arrangement of marriages that relations and boundaries of caste and religion are policed. So, Ambedkar, of course, and this person which about whom I'll talk when I'll do my last example, Santram BA, who founded the Jat Pat Torak Mandal. Both of them in different ways argued that intercaste marriage, was a very important way to annihilate caste because it challenged the relationship between maintenance of caste purity and control of women's sexuality. Um, and, the work of Prem Chaudhary, for example, shows, how in this kind of highly adverse female-male ratio of Punjab, Haryana, many of the Jats, often married, women from lower caste groups, often through this kind of customary practice of kareva or chadarandazi. But what happened was with the coming of colonialism, there was pressure on land, and there were also, the census is leading to these kind of claims of upward mobility, and, this posed a challenge to intercaste relationships, and while the British Penal Code, is saying that, we allow these kind of intercaste marriages, they are introducing notions of modesty and chastity, abduction and enticement as part of a framework of a so-called collective honor. So, and as I said, there are all kinds of fears of this kind of breaking of this kind of roti beti taboos. So, there were these kind of, for example, this cartoon shows, the anxiety about relationship between the servant and the mistress, and servants who may often belong to a kind of lower caste, maybe, or things like that. So there were these fears of intimate relationships, emerging between, upper caste mistresses and, male servants. And even more forbidden, of course, are interreligious intimacies. And this also needs to be kept into mind that in North India, particularly from the 1920s, there are increasing sectarian and communal tensions, and controls were exercised over Muslim women. And but I'm looking at Hindi literature, but you can see similar discourses in other, for example, in Urdu literature. But I'm talking of the dominant caste largely, dominant religious identities largely. So what you see is that, what we see is in the 1920, particularly in the period between non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement, we see there are increasing sectarian and communal tensions, and the day-to-day living of women, with people whom they're buying their stuff, their entertainment, their cultural life, their religious feelings, they are coming under the scrutiny of so-called Hindu ideologues. There are campaigns against, so there are these kind of detailed instructions given to women. There was this pamphlet called Stree Shiksha. I've translated it into English as well. But this kind of this Sri Shiksha gave women these kind of detailed instructions, that you should not go to any graves, you should not go to any kind of visit any peers, you should not buy your bangles from Muslim manihas, you do not buy any household item from Muslims, you do not you keep parda in front of Muslims, etc. There was a campaign against the Muslim bangle sellers, for example, because it involved elements of touch, purity, pollution, etc. There were these kind of instructions given to Hindu women to keep away from a worship of peers, and not to go to the graves. And many women actually visited this because it was supposed to cure barrenness. There were these beliefs, and also it I think allowed an escape from the routine and the mundane, visit to the temple or to the mazar or to the peer. So in some ways, but these women were really attacked, that look at this frenzy of these women, etc. And interestingly, even the kind of discourse around widow remarriage, which was a liberal discourse, of course, which was linked to humanitarian concern, that also got linked to, anxieties of supposed decline in Hindu population. And so it was said that the reproductive capacities of widows should be used to enhance Muslim numbers. Otherwise, they will, like this image that you are seeing on your screen shows that sometimes widows are eloping with Muslim men, they're converting, religious conversions are taking place. So we have to stop this, and so we should encourage widow remarriage so that widows marry Hindu men and they produce Hindu children. So in some ways, what we see is that there are these anxieties of who is bedding and wedding Hindu women. This is embedded in a distinct Hindu nationalism. So what we see is in this period that even romance and elopement, consensual romance, or that came to be, especially interreligious romance, came to be increasingly rewritten as abduction. But I came across these individual cases, interesting cases, some only, of course they're very fragmentary, but how they show of women eloping, or women running away with a lower caste male, or with a Muslim guy, and how there were these kind of there is a language of romance and desire which cuts across religious and caste boundaries, and which defies any kind of community homogeneity. In fact, if you look at the vernacular archive of conversions, religious conversions, then also some interesting facets come out. So for example, let's talk about conversions to Christianity. So for example, while of course it did not lead to significant changes in the status of women or men, those who converted, but at least there was this perception that conversions can become a way to negotiate codified relations, and sometimes it aided a transformative politics of religious and sartorial rights. So conversions to Christianity, for example, signaled discourses of respectability and missions of domesticity, but it opened, for example, opportunities for some of the Dalit women, who refused to do begar or unpaid labor. They got some education. They became trained as, Bible women. And there is a fantastic work of Eliza Kent and others, who've shown, how some of these Dalit women actually became, Bible women, and they started going around preaching. They stopped doing this kind of bag breaking, work or polluted work to which they were confined. So conversion to Christianity, and of course, conversions to Christianity had implications for Dalit women's clothing, because it brought to the fore questions of the body per se vis-a-vis caste. So what we see is traditionally Dalit women had to endure these kind of humiliating dress restrictions, which were also ways to mark their bodies as inferior and sexually promiscuous. And conversion to Christianity perhaps marked a transformed disposition of caste marked bodies. So clothing became this kind of a way to distinguish Dalit Christian women from their unconverted counterparts. So again, I'm picking up these series of cartoons that were published, in a Hindi magazine Chand, and then they were also compiled, in this kind of Vyang Chatravali, and they showed, on the one hand, a Dalit woman who had converted to Christianity, and another Dalit woman who had not converted. So what these cartoons are showing is they're depicting the crisis of conversions, because they are being published in reformist Hindu magazines. There are anxieties about religious conversions, but these anxieties of conversions enter the Hindi print public sphere And they're also putting on display perhaps the sexual unease of reformist Hindus, because even while they are lamenting conversions, they're lamenting the supposed alarming effects of Dalit women's conversions to Christianity. They are addressing Hindus largely, saying that you should be humanitarian towards Dalits, etc. But they cannot help but acknowledge the change in demeanor that conversions brings about, because in their modes of dressing, walking style, gait, and prestige, where Dalit women are enjoying pleasures of umbrellas, purses, hats, skirts, high heeled shoes. Of course, none of the Dalit women are dressing up this way, but it's just that the very fact that, there is this kind of depiction of cartoons, this inadvertently offers to us, I think, a counter politics of sartorial pleasures, and the recalcitrance of love and pleasure, and the kind of interface between norms and everyday practices can sometimes throw up these kind of emancipatory possibilities of intimate rights, where these kind of highly ritualized acts of conversion, clothing, and marriage could at times become a metaphor for a new vocabulary of selfhood, body and dignity. So, and let me move very quickly to my last snapshot. So, this relates to some of the current work, that I'm doing, where I'm working on uh, uh, four individuals, and I'm going to talk about two in this last example. As I said, there's this efflorescence of vernacular sexology in early 20th century. And amidst that, there was this woman, Yashoda Devi, who was perhaps the most read woman actually in early 20th century. She published like more than 40 books. She had this woman's journal, etc. And she was talking about, and she's talking about sexology, but she's also talking about women preparing medicines themselves, women teaching other women, as these images show. There is this kind of sisterhood idea of sisterhood, that you can see in her works. And on the other hand, there was this very interesting person called Santram B.A., whose example I gave you when I was talking of intercaste marriages as well, who was a Shudra anti-caste Arya Samaji reformer. And he very interestingly evolves, through his sexology writings. He also translated Mary Stopes into Hindi for the first time. So he evolved a heterosexual ethics. I think both of them did in different ways, Yashoda Devi and Santram B.A. And they, which gave women a greater place in governing sexual and, their love life. So even while often operating within reformist sexology frames, they sometimes punctured this kind of male-centric authority, and they created ripples and frictions sometimes. So, and they also created, of course, a robust vernacular archive of sexual sciences in India. Because as I said, there was this, a florescence of global Hindu sexology literature in early 20th century. And both Devi and Santram, they capitalized on this boom. And the textual politics of the vernacular and sexology in the vernacular actually fractured claims of the domination of English and Sanskrit in the field. And it is also spreading from elite medical circles and Sanskrit scholars to Hindi speaking kind of publics, and a diverse constituency of educated middle classes, upper caste men, while largely writing these books, they're being read by diverse kind of people. And also, I think what these vernaculars are doing is they are drawing from Indian erotica, and they're drawing from modern sexology texts. They're liberally reinterpreting them as and when needed. And I think the vernacular sexology is also not so neatly translatable as Western sexology. And, there's a lack of fixity in its meaning. So in some ways, the vernacular tells us about the range and plurality and heterogeneity of this field of sexology. So now Devi is very much, like this kind of a social purity feminist, so she's constantly urging her clients to have less sex, as many of the reformers were also doing. She's asking men, but this is interesting. She asks men to control their sexual urges. She's talking about marital rape. She says that men who impose themselves on their wives against their wishes are they are evil, they are like animals. And she's questioning. So even while she's very much within a heteronormative monogamous ideal, she is questioning masculine sexual privileges. And of course there are limits to her discourses, because they show the limits of the kind of an Ayurvedic discourse, which is largely, drawing from Brahmanical kind of texts. On the one hand is Aishwarya Devi. On the other hand is this person, Santram. As I said, he's this anti-caste activist. He's talking about intercaste marriages. He's seeped in a non-Brahmin ideology. And he's really promoting, as I said, intercaste marriages. But at the same time, he also saw himself as an educator of vernacular sexual knowledge. And his anti-caste writings actually cannot be separated from his sexology writings. And because I think in both he's questioning Savarna or upper caste authority. So romantic love emerges as a very powerful metaphor in Santram's both anti-caste and sexology vernacular writings. So he is, so these are all kinds of translations of Vivahit Prem is a translation of Mary Stopes' book. Rati Vigyan is drawing from, other kinds of books, erotica, Sanskrit erotics, and modern sexology. Same with Kamkunj. He translated quite a few of Mary Stopes' books as well. And, he really endorses intercaste marriages, like, for example, he writes, Prem na dekhe jaat gujat, bhoop na dekhe jhuta bhat, so he is really promoting intercaste marriages. But he's also saying that, we should have knowledge of sexology, and we need to go beyond the classics, because they do not provide all sexual answers to the modern conjugal couple. And I think, his kind of translations of Stopes were a serious bid to translate sex, without becoming complicit with its analytical regimes. So, he's inserting footnotes when he's translating Mary Stopes, and he's talking about, the situation in India and conjugal relationships in India. So, and actually, if you look at this, my last slide, his kind of discourse displays the possibility of a Shudra anti-caste perspective, because he's celebrating a utopian sexual future of man-woman relationships, a better family and social order which supported free choice of multiple partners, sex before marriage, so he's providing perhaps a vernacular language of pleasure, cultivation, and transformation of man-woman relationships. And I think these kind of minor and marginal figures enrich and complicate vernacular, histories of sexology. So I'm going to, conclude my talk by saying that these kind of 4 examples that I have taken, 4 or 5 examples, and these kind of snapshots that I have taken, they provide us, vernacular archival registers of forbidden pleasure, sex, and love in colonial India, which sometimes, of course, buttress, but they sometimes also alter dominant historiographical conceits. So whether it is popular erotic literature, homosexuality, clandestine pleasures of domestic sphere, intercaste, interreligious intimacies, or this kind of sexology material, I think this vernacular archives is of course a tactic of the everyday, where pleasure, sex, and romance are pervasive. But this also shows that, how the vernacular is, an important site for the transformation and contestation around matters of love and sex. And I think in the congenial environment of early 20th century, pleasure, sex, and love, while of course it's the high point of nationalism, but they also became active subjects of empirical knowledge in the public vernacular sphere. And, in many ways, print indexed, sex and romance as an object. And, the vernacular was important for these histories of pleasure, and also of a language of control. Because, of course, we need to recognize that these vernacular print cultures, they were largely dominated by Brahmanical and upper caste perspectives. But you can read them in other ways also. You can interrogate them, and they help us draw these connections between female desires and reproduction, between elite and subaltern sexualities. And they also, of course, mess up neat archival predictabilities. So I think, perhaps they open us a way of, by which we can theorize love, sex, and pleasure in more interesting ways. And they produce power relations, but there are also these contradictory impulses which are at the heart of their, which are at the heart of its project. So I think it's this malleability and innovativeness of the vernacular also, which can provide us some promise in our studies of love, sex, and pleasure. So I'm going to end here, and I'm open to questions, comments, and discussions. I don't see many participants.
Yes, and so they are joined us on YouTube. Thank you so much, Professor Gupta, for the lecture. And my first question to you is, we have used the word obscenity a couple of times in the talk, and people were in defense of morality at one point of time, when these such literature were published. So who decided what is obscene and what is chaste? Was it influenced by the Victorian notion of chastity that was prevalent in Europe at that time, because there was a creation of kind of dominant spaces in Europe, in the field of sexuality and literature, and it played a significant part in Europe.
So, as I said, obscenity is a catch-all category. It can encompass a wide range of materials. So even birth control manuals could come under this. Romantic literature would be seen as, obscene, or, and who decides what is erotic and what is obscene? Like they say, for you this is erotic, and my erotic is porn for you, and your erotic is fine, so something like that. So in many ways, I think obscenity is a very, very kind of loose, all encompassing category. And the problem, and of course what we see is, while Britishers and a section of the reformers and the elites are coming from very different kind of spaces, but here they are sometimes unintentionally working in tandem with each other. They all seem to be having this kind of a substantial section. Again, I must say that not all the Britishers are like that. After all, Richard Burton was translating Kama Sutra. He also took out this amazing report on the male brothels of Karachi, which Anjali Arundekar talks in her work, which the report has disappeared from the archives. So, but what I'm saying is, there were, even among the Britishers, there were other kinds of voices. And sometimes the archives provides us these debates, which are very interesting. And even among the Indians, you see, so you have a figure like Santram B.A. or a figure like Krishnakant Malviya, who writes these very interesting kind of सुहागरात बहुरानी को सीख and मनोरमा के पत्र अपने प्रेमियों के नाम. He is writing these kind of, well, he's very much, and he's also the editor of Abhyudaya, the leading newspaper of the time. So, but what happens is that they are drawing from these Victorian notions of chastity, but they also want to show that they are different from the West. So, in fact, there is a whole kind of caricaturing of the Western mem sahib, that our woman, we don't have so much divorce rates. It's the Western woman who's loose, who's, she's caricatured as this antithesis of the chaste, pure Indian woman. And I think that is used as an idea to show that we are, in fact, more civilized than you, and we have a different civilizational ethos. So, and also because there is this, so it's not just these, even the revolutionaries, had this kind of a puritanical streak, that you see in them. So even somebody like Bhagat Singh would say that, marriage is seen as something, marriage or sexual pleasure is seen hampering, your ability to serve the nation. To adopt that sacrificial voice. So I think this obscenity becomes this kind of large category, and I think various voices are intersecting from different perspectives. It's a combination, drawing something from Victorian chastity, but also indigenizing it and offering indigenous notions of what it means to be chaste and civilized. That is also important.
So it's not a homogenized voice. It's kind of diverse voices coming together.
Not necessarily coming together, sometimes speaking from very different angles, but they all are in some ways. There is a section which is strongly objecting to what perceives as obscene. But what I'm trying to show is that while that section is much more dominant, powerful, you do have other kinds of discourses also taking place. Romantic literature emerges as a very, very important category. There is a flourishing of romantic literature at this period, and not all of them is post-marriage. Premarital romances are also being depicted, and they are selling like hotcakes. So there is a kind of, as Dante says, during the French Revolution, people were not just reading Rousseau or Machiavelli; they were reading all kinds of stuff, and there was a rich underbelly of semi-pornographic texts that were being sold. And I think in similar ways that was true for India as well in the colonial period.
And I think it was your 2017 paper called Impossible Love in Colonial North India, where you mentioned about chocolate, and Gandhiji first, he refused. He reacted, I think, like others, when he didn't read it. But after reading it, he appreciated the literature, and he came in defense of chocolate when there was historical reaction by the society.
But the
And
interesting thing is this, he wrote this letter, he initially critiqued it, and it was banned, and it was shown that Gandhi is also supporting the banning. And then when he wrote this letter to, in support of chocolate, Banarsi Das Chaturvedi, who was leading this campaign called the Ghasleti Andolan, he actually suppressed the letter. And it only came out in 1950s, 1957. And then chocolate went into a reprint. And so this is interesting that someone like Gandhi and had that space and that vision to accept something like chocolate. And of course, as I said, chocolate's purportedly it's saying that it is against homosexuality, but I think this notion of homosexuality is as being a Western import that was being made by, let's say, like section of the Indians. And on the other hand, the West is saying that this is something. So the West is saying the East is like they have loose morals, they have loose sexual character. On the other hand, the reformers are saying no, all these notions are coming from the West. So you have this kind of, both are blaming each other, but they're not recognizing that there is a vibrancy of desire and love which is there in different ways in different societies. So just there of all kinds of love.
definitely. Thank you so much, ma'am. And we have questions from the audience. This is by Krishnakant Lahangir. His question is: do we need to focus more on the local imagery of sexuality to engage with global trajectory of the politics of sexuality?
So the local and the global actually really had impact on each other. So, for example, somebody like Santram BA, he's very much, he is reading, as I said, he's translating Mary Stopes, he's translating. So there is this kind of, I think, global sexology, for example, that is building up, in the early 20th century, which is having an impact on the local kind of expressions of it, but they're also drawing from their own indigenous kind of, so they're saying that they're combining Shastric and the Vaigyanic, and they're combining. So I think the local becomes a very important mirror to look at the larger kind of global happening. So, and I'm not just saying this in terms of questions of sexuality and obscenity, but for example, even something like communism, which has this kind of global manifestations. I think it's very important to look at some of its local kind of happenings. So only then can you see how, there are continuities and there are ruptures, that happen when the way it manifests in a particular context, in a particular time period, in a particular region, in a particular local. I think history teaches you that the micro is extremely significant to understand the macro.
He asks another question, that why a woman's sexuality is still a dangerous thing and why we absolutely reject the concept of sexuality in the field of women.
So yeah, that is there. So women are often seen as objects of desires and not subjects of desire. They're not seen as themselves actively. There is, and what has happened is, in the discourses of gender, there is a lot of emphasis on women as victims, and of course that needs to be stressed, with kind of rising rape cases and the kind of commodification that we see of women's bodies. Of course, there is this kind of argument made, but I think while we need to recognize that and discuss that, I think the overwhelming emphasis on victimhood has left us, to not emphasize the women's pleasures. And there is this historically, there were these kind of quotes which said that, women have 8 times sexual desire than men, at guna. These kind of anxiety, and what this shows is again anxiety about women's pleasure, because women are seen as this fulcrum of the family, of the discourse of the domesticity, and the patriarchal structures need to have this control over women's sexuality. And because women are also seen as not having such fixed religious and caste identities, their caste and religious identities are perceived as much more fluid, which perhaps they are, because they get married, they get move on, something like that. So it's seen as much more fluid, which creates these kind of anxieties regarding women's sexuality. And so control over women's sexuality becomes extremely central for the dominant kind of, not just for dominant patriarchies, but I think for the normative societal controls to be exercised. And that is why it's the women's sexuality that comes under much more scrutiny. So I would say that even male sexuality came under some kind of scrutiny in the colonial period. And this whole discourse of brahmacharya, was addressed to male sexuality, that, you need to control your semen, you need to preserve your sexual energy. So, but yeah, it is definitely the women's sexuality that has come under much more lens, scrutinized, controlled, disciplined.
Keshav Bansal asks that, could you shed some light on courtesan or vessels vis-a-vis changing or evolving meanings of love, sex, and desire? And was a sphere or space of brothel or a kotha also proportionately affected by colonialism and nationalism?
Yeah, so there is a lot of work on this, whether it's Philippa Levine or Ashwini Tambe. There are a series of historians who've particularly looked at this. So, the courtesans, what happened was, with the coming of colonialism, there was declining patronage. There was a criminalization of the courtesan. And what the British was doing is, they were clubbing all kinds of sex workers or all kinds of women under the category of the prostitute. So it encompassed the Notch girls, the courtesan, the Devdasi, the cantonment sex workers. So there is this kind of the kind of variations that were there were all homogenized and clubbed, in some ways by the Britishers. And what they are doing is, of course, the courtesan, on the one hand, there is this kind of criminalization of the courtesan. Again, it is associated with, there is also this kind of court culture, and which needs to be attacked, and so the courtesan becomes a symbol of that. She also, it becomes a symbol of breaking homes, and this kind of new ideals of monogamous companionate marriages that are coming up. So what we see is that there is a decline in the status of the courtesan, who was not just a sex worker. She was a singer, she was a dancer, she could have many accomplishments. There were many courtesans who were paying heavy taxes to the government. They had property, so the courtesan declined. So on the one hand, of course, what you see is that the figure of the prostitute comes under increasing scrutiny. There are these contagious diseases acts which come up, which allow examination of the body of these kind of cantonment sex workers, the women who are around the cantonments, and lal bazaars are coming up, separate areas for sex workers. You also see these kind of lock hospitals where where sex workers could be examined by the British. Their bodies could be examined. But again, that is there and that needs to be seen. But I think there is also an other side of picture, which is that in this period, because of these establishment of lal bazaars and all, the courtesans are getting organized. They're giving petitions to the government. They are getting organized. They are saying, not as the regular sex workers. There is again a democratization of sex work in some ways, because it's becoming much wider in number. Some of them found avenues in theater, cinema, if you in these kind of openings. They are getting organized. They're giving petitions to the government that they need to have their space, that they need to have certain rights, etc. They are also what they're saying is they also found ways of escaping these kind of regimentations, which the government was imposing, by either running away or disappearing or doing all kinds of things. So what happened in the 1857, some of the courtesans really helped the rebels, and that also became another reason why courtesans were attacked. So there are various reasons: the Victorian morality, the kind of attack on the decline in patronage, the kind of the links with 1857, the kind of declining wealth status, etc. So because of that, they came to be increasingly attacked. But there are other ways and avenues that women found to in this field, this arena of sex work, and much larger in number. Actually, they emerged in the colonial period.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there's one other question by Arpit Shah. What kind of influence temple sculptural erotica had on Indian male or female, and how Victorians were looking at such sculptures, moral or immoral?
So again, I'm not a scholar of ancient India, and I think a historian of ancient India will be much better to answer this question. But I can say this, that what we see is, again, I won't say everyone, but a section of Britishers were horrified and fascinated, both by these kind of temple, erotic descriptions, displays, visual displays on various temple carvings, and they again, this fed into the discourses of obscenity and the kind of Victorian morality and chastity. And to say that the East is this these kind of colonized have these loose kind of moral kind of characters. On the other hand, what we see is that there were also these attempts to erase, and to, like, suppose if it's same-sex desires, depictions of same-sex desires, or depictions of homoerotic descriptions, they were attempts to erase them, to modify them. That is also going on by some of the Indians that we see. And the third is that it is absorbed also as part of the little tradition of Hinduism, as so it is. See, sexual depiction is fine as far as it's seen as part of erotica, as some high culture or high sculptures or things like that, so the moment it comes to the masses, it becomes problematic. Then it is described as obscene, pornographic, and this, it's the mass culture that makes it in some way. So Kalidas's erotic descriptions of Kumar Sambhav and all that are very much acceptable, or even a text like Kama Sutra is accepted by a section, as because it's meant for the elite, it's argued that it is meant for people who understand sex, so the moment it becomes available to the public in distorted forms, maybe, but in other forms, it creates more anxiety. So the coming of print actually, because there are other kinds of depictions also available. Thin pamphlets are coming out, which are borrowing selectively from these acts. They could be, and they're selling them, and footpath literature is coming up. That creates even more anxieties.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And somebody's
And
asking
I'm
if
so sorry about the PowerPoint. And I wasn't seeing the chat. So I wish somebody had interrupted me earlier, So my apologies for that.
but you explained so well that we were not focusing on the imagery or the text, but we were listening to you. There's one last thing that somebody wanted. If you can recall some of the books that you can recommend on this theme, because this is often not well
So
covered theme.
there is this very nice edited collection by Francesca Orsini, which is Love in South Asia, something like that, so it's called, or something like that. Then there is this very nice article by Tapan Ray Chaudhary on love in a colonial climate. There is this work, my book is there, the Sexuality, Obscenity Community, the other one, The Gender of Caste, in which I talk about love, pleasures, and romances. There is also there is Roshna Majumdar's work on on marriages in colonial Bengal. So there are, if there are now scholars are working on these kind of new works, which are emerging around meanings of pleasure and love. And of course there are works like, for example, my colleague has just edited a book on pleasures in history, and there are articles which are talking of the ancient period, or they're talking of the kind of Nazir Parabadi and these kind of fascinating Urdu poets, who are talking. So there are now quite a bit of material that is available, and I can later share a much more detailed list with Ishan if anyone wants, and that can be circulated with exact references, etc., on this topic.
Yes, ma'am. And two of your papers are available on ResearchGate called Dirty Hindi Literature
Or
Contest
if you
of
go to
Obscenity.
academia.edu, you can freely join it. I have
Yes.
uploaded almost all my stuff there. So lots of articles on love and all. And if you look at the reading list of that, you will get more references.
Yes.
But I can definitely share more. There is this book by Aparna Bandyopadhyay, which talks of love marriages, again in the context of colonial Bengal. In the modern times, there's a book by Parvez Modi, which talks of love marriages in Delhi. And that is much more in the contemporary context she's talking about. So, and there are quite a bit of works that have now emerged, which are talking about these subjects.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time early in the morning to deliver this lecture, which I think a theme which is not um, have gotten its due in mainstream history. Unfortunately, thank you so much for talking about those forbidden histories this morning. And there are a couple of announcements for viewers who have joined us. Our next session is going to be on 25th of October at 5 p.m. on our YouTube channel called Landscapes and Identities in History, Narratives of Encounter and Interface in the Vijayanagar Empire by Dr. Ranjita Datta, Associate Professor at Center for Historical Studies, JNU. And for those who wish to get notifications of all our lectures, and whenever we go live on YouTube, you have to click on the subscribe button just down this video. There's a red button called subscribe. You have to click on that. Click on the bell icon also, so that you can get notifications on your YouTube app or on your phone. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor Gupta.
Thanks.
And if anybody have any other question, please mail us at caravanheritage@gmail.com. We'll forward those questions to Professor Gupta, and she can get back to you through emails. So thank you so much, and we'll end the live now. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.